Okay team, this video is for the narrative junkies, the true fans, those who've been with me for a long time and have been wondering, where does the story of the 13th, where does the story of the Penitent Forge fit in? Now the clock has ticked forward, now the galaxy has moved on, now that Guilliman is back. Those of you that are new to the channel, this video probably won't make very much sense to you, but I have been getting a lot of questions from a lot of people asking me, what about the 13th? What's happening now? And this is the video for you. This is the video where you need to sit down, pick up a paintbrush, and I'll explain where my armies fit in the new narrative. Very keen to get this story out there. I've got pages and pages and pages of written stuff about the 13th, and mainly about the 13th, I have to say, rather than the Penitent Forge. So this video will wander between me free-forming it, if that's a word, just spieling away like I am now, and some of the pages of the written text that I've got written down. After I've explained where we are now in the galaxy and how I see the shaping narrative, the shifting meta-narrative, the overall arching theme of the game, how I explain how that fits in with my little bit of narrative, then I'm going to go through a couple of these pages for you and answer some of the other questions people have been asking me about certain characters, certain people, and about the 13th. So this video will wander. This video is just me talking. I'm learning a whole new skill set here. This is the first time I've done it on a voice recorder, and there should be some lovely images up on the screen. I say there should be, from Anton Magdalena, who's also a fan, who's also one of you guys who loves the narrative as well, and did these stunning images for me. So yeah, without much further ado, let's jump in. Okay, so let's start with a little bit of pre-written text here just to get the juices flowing. So while the history of the 40k universe has expanded over the last 30 years, and our knowledge of certain great conflicts and great events, such as the Horus Heresy, has grown and grown, while the past has been unlocked, the future was always hidden from us for decades. The doomsday clock had stopped at 1 minute to midnight. The grimdark was always on the brink, always about to fall. The Necrons had awoken. The Nids had invaded the galactic rim. A great psychic awakening had stirred the stars, and the Imperium was pressed as never before. And the clock had stopped. We were forever trapped in the grim darkness of the far future, where there was only war. And there was no way out. There was no way forward, no end. There would be no respite amongst the stars. Only the laughter of thirsting gods, and I say was, because the clock has ticked, midnight has come, and the world, the galaxy of 40k, has changed forever. A great rift has torn the galactic map in two. A new breed of space marine has been created, and a loyal son of Ultramar now leads the Imperium of man once more. It's very exciting. The galaxy became a darker, deadlier place now. But a new crusade has begun. There is a light in the dark. Even if it is the last brief flutter of a candle flame against a storm, there's a light around which we might gather one more time, if only to see the demons rushing towards us. I have to say, I think the Imperium is screwed. Even if Guilliman manages to push back the tide of chaos, even if a few of his brothers, fellow Primarchs, return to lend him a hand, how can he push past the Great Rift, or how can he undo what has been done to the very fabric of reality? How do you put stitches in the canvas of heaven? And what are the Xenos threats, and what of the Imperium itself? Do we really want to see the other Primarchs come back to lend Guilliman a hand? I mean, the last time the Primarchs got together on a great crusade to retake the galaxy, it didn't turn out very well. And amid this backdrop, where do the remnants of the 13th founding chapters fit in to the new narrative? Where are my space marines? Where are the Penitent Forge? What are they doing? Well, I'll answer the Penitent Forge question first, because it's easier and quicker, and essentially the Penitent Forge have been recalled to Mars and designate 17, and will lead some of the tech priests from the Penitent Forge, which, as you guys should know, it's a fleet-based forge world. Very many large fleet-based forge ships out there. We'll lead a delegation back to Mars, where we will re-sign the Martian Accords and be re-entered into the annals of Mars, be counted as a Martian forge world, ready to start the Indomitus Crusade under Guilliman and designate 17, and ready to help retake the stars. My Space Marine chapter, and I shouldn't really say chapter, I should say army, because they're larger than chapter strength, are the remnants. They're the bits and pieces of the 13th founding Space Marine founding, of which the Adeptus Terra does not hold any gene seed samples, and for a long time they have been considered renegade. They don't consider themselves renegade. They consider themselves their own people. There's the bits and pieces left over from many different Space Marine chapters, and they pulled together and they grouped together, and eventually, after about 1,000 years, became stronger, became a fleet-based chapter, and they've grown and grown and grown. Since then, they're able to replicate their own gene seed or recover their own gene seed and implant it into new Space Marines. They're able to find new inductees from the planets that they rescue, from the outposts and war-torn areas that they help out. At the end of this video, as I mentioned, there'll be some narrative about the 13th and about some of their exploits. But now we are very strong. Now we are, there's a few million humans amongst the 13th fleet. There's a number of Astra Militarum and Navy Nobilites amongst us as well. And we were floating amongst the stars, battered and attacked by the Xenos threat, the Chaos, and by the Imperium, who didn't like what we were up to, didn't like the colour of our jib, because we refused to bow to the new Imperium. We followed the Imperial Creed, the old ways of doing things. And because we're made from many different chapters, that's why there's no squad markings on any of the armour. That's why there is no chapter master amongst the 13th. There's never been a chapter master. Well, there has been, but they got wiped out, and there is no one amongst them. Because they follow the Imperial Creed, there is no way for them to promote from within their own chapter master these sorts of ways of doing things. There's rules for it, there's systems for it, and because we follow the Imperial Creed to the letter, the teachings of the Emperor, we have no Emperor, we have no Primarch who could create a chapter master from the inside. So we stuck to the way of doing things as they were. And we carried on and fought the good fight. And now this great rift has ripped the galaxy in two. And the 13th obviously survived the coming of the great rift. I'm going to continue to fight with my Space Marine chapter. And let's skip to the end. Let's tell you guys exactly what happened. So the 13th would have been in deep space, where they often go, where they often retreat to ride out the storms. A fleet in deep space, trying to find a fleet in deep space would be like trying to find one particular grain of sand in all the beaches on all the planets. Planets or planet on this planet would be like to find one specific grain of sand on this planet on one of the beaches, because the universe is so immeasurably vast. Look up into the night sky, how vast this place is. So we often retreat to the calm of deep space to ride out the storms, and that's where they would have been, where the coming of the Great Rift would have happened, and they would have heard about the fall of Cadia. They would have heard about the coming of Guilliman, the new Lord Protector of the Imperium. They would have heard about the new Crusade, the Indomitus Crusade, and they would have wondered what it meant for them. And they would have heard about the new founding of Space Marines called the Ultima Founding. And they would have heard about the Primera Space Marines, and they would have certainly saw up in the night sky or across the galactic plane this great red rift, the Crimson Path, ripped the galaxy in two. And Guilliman contacted them. Lord Protector of the Imperium contacted them, reached out to them and asked for a rendezvous, asked to meet up with a couple of the leaders or the leader of the 13th. And the 13th because they were called out by a Primarch, and because they follow the Imperial truth, well, they would have answered the call this time. Sol Garrow, Gabriel Locke, a number of the leaders of the 13th would have met with Guilliman and his entourage in deep space. And I imagine the captains of the 13th flying across to this massive strike cruiser, unarmed, unadorned, no battle markings on their armor, no purity seals hanging off them, and walking out and going to the bridge or going to this audience chamber, this vast audience chamber. And inside this audience chamber, there would have been Primaris Space Marines. There'd have been other Space Marines looking at them. There'd have probably been custodes in there as well. And then Guilliman enters the room, and everyone hits a knee. The custodes bow. The Primaris Space Marines bow. The chapters that are assembled in that room hits bows. But the 13th stand. The 13th do not take a knee. The 13th do not bend. They're proud to be there. They stare at Guilliman. A little quirk of a smile passes Guilliman's lips. But the 13th do not bend. And then they talk. And the Guilliman would have asked them, I have come to speak to your chapter master. Sol Garrow says, there are no chapters here. So Guilliman asks, who rules you? Who rules the 13th? And Sol Garrow would have said, the Emperor. Then who speaks for you? Asked Guilliman. Sol Garrow would have explained that every captain speaks for himself, as do the fleet components, that the 13th are together by choice, not force. And then Guilliman asks, then who will command the reinforcements I send? And with a stroke of a pen and with the command of a Primarch, the 13th will be inducted into the Imperial fold. They will be counted as a successor chapter of the Ultramarines. This way they're kind of under Guilliman's protection, kind of under Guilliman's umbrella. Even though that there's different chapters gene seed in amongst their ranks, they have to be written into somewhere into the Imperial annals, so they'll be counted as an Ultramarine successor chapter. However, going forward, as and when I need to, and as and when the 13th want to, we will use different chapter tactics if they exist in the new 41st millennium. I'm sure they will when the codexes arrive, but as and when we need to use different chapter tactics, we will use different chapter tactics. But for most intents and purposes, we'll be counted as an Ultramarine successor chapter. They will not be taken out of their fleet. They'll be allowed to continue doing what they do, follow the Imperial Creed, follow crusading throughout the galaxy, but this time with the approval of the Primarch himself. He's looked upon their works and he approves. And he wants to give them some Primaris Space Marines. So I'll get some Primaris Space Marines. These guys will wear a slightly different blue because obviously there's no gene seed of the 13th for which to make Space Marines. These guys will be true descendants of Ultramar. They will be in an Ultramarine successor chapter. They will form part of the 13th, and I will call them the Second Company. So you'll have the 13th on the tabletop, sometimes the 13th and the Second Company on the tabletop, which will be the same chapter. And sometimes, or going forward in the future, sometimes I will just field the Second Company of the 13th, and I'll call them the Second Company. The 13th will be allowed to continue to exist, continue to do what it does at Legion strength, rampaging throughout the stars, and the Second Company will, to all intents and purposes, be part of the 13th and fall under the 13th's command. I still see us bumping heads every now and then with some Imperial forces, particularly the Inquisition, and particularly some outliers and some outriggers from other Space Marine chapters or other Imperial forces, because it's going to take a while for the message to get out there. Or there's always reasons for Imperial armies to attack each other. But Papa Smurf has come back and he has forgiven the 13th for their past transgressions, or rather shouted out all the other chapters for transgressing against us. So the 13th are back. We're in the Imperial fold. And from time to time, Guilliman himself, Primarch and Lord Protector of the Imperium, will fight with the 13th, and we will follow Ultramarines chapter tactics, and we will benefit from his great wisdom, his warlord skills. And I'm really, really looking forward to it. Having Guilliman on my side and having the Primaris Space Marines on my side. And it just makes perfect sense that if they had told, if Guilliman had said, right, we're splitting you up, then they would have probably gone nuts and started fighting and fight out to the death. If someone was turning up to take over the control of the 13th, then they would have probably gone nuts and tried to fight their way out there, fiercely independent. But Guilliman is a insane strategist. He's a man who's been around for a very, very long time, and he would recognize in the 13th that they are deployed and arranged as the legions of old. He would have seen more in common with what he sees in the ranks of the 13th than he does in the ranks of the Astartes that he's in control of. And because of this, in the future, we need a chapter master. We need someone who rules over the Legion itself, who rules over the 13th itself. So not straight away, but in the future, once we are reinforced, once we have the Primaris Space Marines, and once we've won a few campaigns ourselves, and once Guilliman is seen and appraised who is the best captain amongst the 13th, he will promote a chapter master finally to lead the 13th. And will it be Sol Garrow? Will it be Gabriel Locke? Or will it be someone else? We shall see who's the greatest hero in the next year. I'm looking forward to seeing how this narrative evolves in my battle reports, and we will see who earns the rank of Chapter Master of the 13th, the first one since Manus. It's going to be fun times. Okay, that's where the 13th are now. That's where my narrative stands now for my chapters for the Penitent Forge, but I'm not finished yet. Oh no. Like I said, I've got pages and pages of stuff written about the 13th that has accumulated over the many, many years, and I want to share some of those stories with you. So for those of you who are interested, please listen on. For those of you who've had the answers that you seek, thank you very much for listening, and happy wargaming. But I'm going to crack on, because the 13th Fleet is a coalition of humans and Astartes that has existed outside of Imperial control since the 13th founding at the end of M35. And for the first 1,000 years, however, they couldn't really call themselves a fleet. Back then, they were a very small band of Space Marines hunted and persecuted at every turn. And they grew in number and they shrank in number, but they were almost driven to extinction on more than one occasion. They came from many chapters, they wore many colours, and they were the remnants of the 13th founding chapters. And I want to take you back to the very start, the very beginning of the 13th Fleet, when they picked up their first Grand Cruiser. And then I want to flip forward to the very end of the 13th Fleet and the last story that I've got written down. In the meantime, I want to explain how big I see the 13th Fleet and what it looks like. If you've listened to the previous story time, you've got a general background of the 13th, and you know the general story behind them. But what does it look like when I talk about the 13th Fleet? Well, in my narrative, there are 208 ships in the 13th Fleet at the present time, of which 12 belong exclusive to the Astartes of the 13th founding, and in total the fleet is home to 2 million people, of which 400,000 are men-at-arms, and of that 400,000, approximately 270,000 are Navy Militarum, 110,000 are Army Militarum, and I see them having 20,000 Astartes amongst the 13th Fleet. The current fleet numbers, well, there's 67 ships of the line and 141 ships of the estate. This is significant enough for pirate corsairs, hostile Xenos fleets, rogue trader unions to stay away, but not significant enough to take on a full Imperial fleet when they came up against them, or threaten a gateway world, and is absolutely tiny, this number, when compared towards Orc Wars or Hive fleets, or true renegade war fleets such as the Red Corsairs, for example. Basically, the 13th Fleet are very big enough to take care of themselves, but not so big enough to attract the attention of planet killers. They don't want to attract the attention of planet killers. Of the ships of the line, the battle-ready ships, there are two flagships, Apocalypse-class battleships. For those of you who know 40k narrative, you know Apocalypse-class battleships are the largest size of battleship that the Imperium churns out. There are very few ships actually larger than Apocalypse-sized battleships, such as Gloriana-class cruisers and stuff. Apocalypse-sized battleships are about 15 kilometers in length. These two flagships are called the Defiant and the Invincible. And then there are three Victory-class battleships. These are about 10 kilometers in length, called Again in Darkness, She Knows No Fear, and Rampage. And there are two Grand Cruisers, also 8, 9, 10 kilometers in length, the Summoning and the Old and Revered, the Start of Things, the first of our main ships of the line. And the story that I'm going to go into in a second starts off with the Start of Things. That old and revered Grand Cruiser. There are 8 cruisers, there are 19 escort ships, frigates, destroyers and corvettes, and 21 escort defense monitors, which is a lot of escort defense monitors, because these typically hang out with the ships of the estate, the civilian craft. And there are also 12 Space Marines battle barges of various patterns. Of the 141 ships of the estate, the civilian crafts, there are 108 gun cutters and packet ships. These are used by privileged persons, private defense forces, private militia groups, and small unions that are allied to the 13th that we've either rescued over the time, and this is all that remains of them, or who have joined us, mercenaries who have joined us, who are considered outlaws from the Imperium but don't consider themselves outlaws. There are 10 rogue traders, sanctioned to trade amongst the 13th. There are 11 fabricator ships, 8 of which are hydroponic vat ships and 3 are munition ships. And for those of you who know your 40k narrative, you know that 8 hydroponic vat ships is more than enough, much more than enough. It's enough actually to feed a crusade armada. We've got more ships creating food than we need to. That's on purpose. That's because every now and then when we rescue outposts, mining colonies, moons, return to war-torn battlefields to mop up after the Imperium has waged through, we don't just bring aid in the form of bullets and guns, we bring food aid as well. We feed the world and make it a better place. And the 13 munition ships, again on the 13th fleet size, you only need one of these things. These munition ships, these fabricator ships, make everything from bullets to bedposts to tank panels, and to help keep the 13th fleet going. One of them is what you would call a fleet repair ship, fabricator ship, a ship that makes ships, and it'll drag behind it lots of cargoes, lots of bits of steel, plastisteel, ceramite, bits of asteroid. And this ship helps repair the bits from the other ships. And we've got a third one which does a bit of both. And again, you don't need 3 full munition ships, fabricator ships of this type. We've got more than enough to keep us going. And therefore, we can also help the war-torn people that we meet. There's 12 transports amongst the 13th. Including the Universe mass conveyor, the Face of the Sea. Universe-class mass conveyors are the largest ships the Imperium make. These behemoths are 150 kilometers in length approximately. These ships are floating cities. They are lightly armored, but studied all over with lots and lots of point defenses, and they often come with their own shields. The Universe-class mass conveyor, the Face of the Sea, does have its own shields. And half of the total population of the fleet is in the Face of the Sea. 1 million souls live here. And the end of our narrative, we'll talk about how we got the Face of the Sea. I'll talk about that because that's the last story. That was the last ship of the great ships that joined the 13th. A couple of things to note. The fleet has been roughly the same size for the last 2,500 years. We've added some more here or there, like the Face of the Sea. But while it's been quite a bit larger, it's also been devastated more than once. And they've discovered the hard way that approximately 200 ships seems to be the right number. Obviously, there's strength in numbers and they don't want to be too small. But when they've grown too large, they can encounter other problems, both internal and external. External problems like planet killers take notice and take the occasional swipe at them. And when they grew too large, simple governance, order and stability can become an issue. This is not a good thing. So needless to say, the 13th has been smashed by planet killers more than once. The fleet has also learned to police itself, to manage its own society and keep chaos at bay. And they've learned these lessons the hard way. How does the fleet deploy in space? Well, the first thing to note is that almost all the Space Marine battle barges and one or two of the cruisers or ground cruisers and their escort ships are always absent from the main fleet. They are off prosecuting missions in other sectors. Basically, the ships of the line rotate in and out from the bulk of the fleet. The 10 road traders that are allied to the 13th and call the fleet their home are also always coming and going. And it's also been known for the battleships to leave the core fleet from time to time when there is a particularly hard target for the 13th that they want to smash or soften up, or when they need to make a serious impression for whatever reason. This is typically a measure of last resort. It's not taken lightly. However, the fleet is not a fixed entity, essentially. The numbers are always shifting, they're always moving, it's a fluid thing. However, as a general rule of thumb, 50% of the battle-ready ships of the line are with the civilian ships, the ships of the estate, at any one time. And this means that elements of the fleet are engaged in multiple war zones across multiple sectors at the same time. They try their best to pick and choose the engagements where they hope to make a difference. They try to avoid protracted, drawn-out engagements, for example, and hellscapes such as large planet-wide conflicts. They'd much rather defend the underdogs, the downtrodden, the forgotten. And the preferred theatres of war would be outposts or colonies, mining complexes and moons. They prefer to sweep and clear sectors after the Imperium or hostile Xenos forces have been and gone and left only ruin behind them. It would be impossible for them to stand up against planet killers, as I say. So they tend to come through the wreckage of warscapes and rescue who they can, stamp out the remaining Xenos threat where they can, or answer calls from these little colonies, places where they can make a difference. So the core fleet can be found either in deep space or in a friendly system where they've helped out. The 13th will spend as much as half of their time in deep space, which is a highly unusual practice and probably the key to their continued survival. The reason for staying in deep space is simple. Deep space is so unbelievably vast. The chances of being found are close to infinity. The 13th have never been attacked in deep space and will often retreat there after a major campaign or when the probing eyes of the Inquisition draw too close. They'll think nothing of keeping the bulk of the fleet in deep space for 100 years or so if need be, while the ships of the line will venture forth on missions. Ship ratings have been born and lived and died in deep space, far from the terror and tyranny that's visited on most of humanity throughout the galaxy. And 100 years in deep space in the grim darkness of the far future where you're not living in a hive city or not attacked by Xenos threats, it's as close to paradise as you get in the grim dark future. As for friendly systems, well, friendly systems come and go. And the 13th Fleet may be welcome for all sorts of reasons. Typically, they've helped a system in some way. A battle barge or cruiser may have helped defeat marauders or a Xenos threat, the usual thing. So long as the 13th had stayed away from key worlds, key systems, sector primaris worlds and the like, it was frighteningly easy to pass unnoticed in the Imperium, but they don't need to pass unnoticed in the Imperium now. That's how they did it in the past. You see, as I mentioned, the fleet learned its lesson such a long time ago, and one of the key lessons was to stay away from the densely populated sectors or strategic rearming and refueling points. And as I mentioned, it fits with their philosophy to help the downtrodden, the lost, and the abused. And there is one last factor we must consider. These war-torn outposts, these broken worlds and systems, not only can the 13th find safe haven in these places, but they can find fighters and survivors. And amongst those survivors, they can find aspirants and recruits Show me an outpost, a mining colony or a trade station that's been overrun and destroyed by the alien, the heretic or the traitor. Show me the survivors on that colony. Find the holes in which they hide and offer them a chance to fight back. And I'll show you some of the toughest, most resourceful, most determined killers this side of the Great Rift. And so, from the fires of hell, the 13th recruit new members. And in the galaxy of the 41st millennium, well, there's plenty of hell out there. So let's crack on. Let's go back to the very start of the story of the 13th and let me tell you how it finally became a fleet. Because after living through the age of strife in M35, these Astartes of the 13th founding chapters would no longer bow to the church or the bloated mess the Imperium had become. Their chapters, the chapters of the 13th founding, had been the puppets and pawns of the ecclesiarchy. They were superhuman soldiers. They were the greatest weapon that the Emperor had ever created at the time, and they'd been used without thought or remorse, and they'd been turned against the Imperium itself. And as we know, that time became the Reign of Blood, and that even that name does not do it justice. It was the greatest conflict the galaxy had ever seen since the Horus Heresy, and there would never be an internal conflict like it again. And so after the Reign of Blood and the Age of Strife, the 13th founding chapters decided to follow only the imperial truth, those original teachings from the Emperor of Man. And after 1,000 years of doing this, 1,000 years of near extinction and fighting and hiding in a galaxy that hated them and called them renegades, they slowly managed to grow in number and slowly managed to build a fleet around them. And this growth and the survival of the 13th founding chapters would not have been possible had they not decided to allow guardsmen and navymen amongst their ranks. And after 1,000 years of brutal struggle, at the spaceport of Viridia 12x12, everything changed. Viridia 12x12 was a gigantic refueling outpost at the very edge of Imperial space on the galactic fringe of the Orpheus sector, and in M3692, it had been smashed and rebuilt and smashed again by pirate raids, and then finally, at the stroke of an Imperial pen in a hive city a million light years away, it was marked down as a black asset. It was marked down as unrecoverable, not worth the effort of saving. The people on Viridia 12x12 were never told, of course, and continued to fight and die when the raiders hit again and again, and they thought the spaceport could never be written off. They thought the spaceport was massive. It consisted over 250,000 souls, and it was guarded by 10 ships of the line, including battleships, and it was vital, and they believed it could never fall, and they were wrong. When the 13th intercepted the SOS, the spaceport had been unsupplied for 12 years, and only 20,000 souls remained, and only 3 ships of the line, and they'd been attacked and attacked again for a decade. They'd suffered more than 90% casualties. They'd lost 3/4 of their fleet. And back then, the 13th, we're talking 4,000 years ago now, had only 1 battle barge and 233 Astartes, not 20,000, 233. And still they decided to help. When the 13th translated in system 1 week later, the port was under attack yet again by Dark Eldar pirates from the Cabal of the Last Hatred. For those of you who've been following the channel for a while, you know they're the boogeymen from the Dark Eldar on this channel, the Cabal of the Last Hatred. And the 13th were too late. Viridia 12x12 was broken, it was burning. 2 out of the remaining ships of the line were gutted and running cold, and the 3rd ship was burning for the Mandeville point to translate out of the system when the 13th appeared. And this cruiser, this ship, appeared to be the only thing left in the system. So for a day, these 2 ships would close in on each other at sublight speeds, the 13th going into the system, this cruiser coming out of the system. The Imperial cruiser refusing any hails from the 13th, but when the Astartes grew closer, they could see why. Auspex revealed the ship had been boarded and overrun, and it was now captained by the Dark Eldar. With the spaceport and all Imperial ships lost, it was clear the Xenos had won, and there was no one left to save. Despite this, and despite having only 200 plus Astartes to their name, the 13th boarded the cruiser anyway. Drawing lead on this mission was honoured brother Captain Pollux Matthius. While he would not survive this mission, the 13th won the day. The Xenos, who had been raiding Viridia 12x12 on and off for the best part of a decade without any sign of Imperial reinforcements, did not expect a battle barge to suddenly appear. So the Xenos they too were undermanned, no more than a few thousand Cabalites, the rest of their numbers having already fled back to the Webway, back to Cormorant, and they were not expecting the type of Space Marine they met that day. They did not recognize the chapter. The 13th bore no insignia or markings, nor could they determine any singular tactic, rather multiple tactics and multiple doctrines used by different squads at different times, and the sheer ferocity these Astartes unleashed, as though they were fighting for their lives, was something the Cabal of the Last Hatred were woefully unprepared for. And so it was, on the very bridge of the ship, when Captain Pollux Matthias fell under a hail of poisoned rounds, another Astarte stepped forward, then another and another. Each it would seem a captain in his own right. Each it would seem a hero from 1,000 worlds and 1,000 hells. And there was nothing the Cabal could do. They were broken. They were exterminated. It was after the battle was over the 13th found the Navymen. Over 8,000 people imprisoned in the holds below. They were the last survivors of the 250,000 people from Viridia 12x12, and in amongst them were women and children, starved, terrified, but saved from becoming cattle and playthings of the Dark Eldar. And the 13th, well, they would have left them then. They would have left them to find their own way in a brutal galaxy, as they had done before when they had rescued civilians. But honoured brother Captain Matthias had seen something in these humans, something of a kindred spirit perhaps. These mortals had been abandoned by the Imperium, and yet they had fought on and on for over a decade. And before then, they'd been subject to indiscriminate raids and brutal hardship. There was a fire in these people, an anger for vengeance and for justice, and like the 13th, they could call no planet their home, only the endless darkness of space. Perhaps Brother Matthias saw something of himself reflected in these people, and so he called for a cogitator and recorded his last decree. He had been led out in the infirmary. He had been told that his wounds were too grave and that his life was beyond saving. And as he lay there bleeding and dying, he ordered that his men must accept these mortals into their ranks if the people of Viridia 12x12 so wished. And they wished it. So the 13th Fleet began. The grand cruiser that the 13th had liberated was renamed the Start of Things. It was old and it was worn, but it was a grand cruiser, still 7 kilometers from bow to stern, and it would be the first of many. Because shortly after the 13th decided to add mortals to their ranks, the hunting and hiding started to end, and the rebuilding and the growing began. Over time, more ships were added to their ranks, and they went from strength to strength, eventually becoming a large fleet. As for Captain Pollux Matthias, well, he never really died. He was interred into the sarcophagus of a dreadnought and fights on to this day. He is the oldest surviving member of the 13th, and he has known 5,000 years of war. Incidentally, as a side note, for those of you who listened to the previous story time and know the story of the Angel's Graveyard and know of Chapter Master Manus heroically escaping the Angel's Graveyard, this battle zone which became the crucible of death for 4 of the 13th founding original chapters. All 4 of these chapters wiped out, and Manus survived along with 1 other Space Marine. Well, every person from the 13th Fleet knows this story, and have often wondered, was Matthias that 1 other Space Marine? After all, Matthias has proven time and again so damn hard to kill. However, asking a 5,000-year-old dreadnought about the horrors they would rather forget is not something that comes easily to anyone, and it's not honourable. It doesn't serve a military purpose, and also Matthias has only ever woken from his slumber to engage in battle, not idle chatter. So it's said that no one's ever asked Matthias whether he stood there with Manus. However, there was that one bunker on that one hill, and a new breed of Space Marine, That brother managed to ask him, and his name was Sol Garrow. And yeah, maybe I'll tell that story another day. Anyway, so now you have some idea about how the fleet began, how after 1,000 years of near extinction, the Astartes of the 13th founding chapter found their first grand cruiser and admitted mortals into their ranks. And because of this change, they started to form into something new. They started to not only survive, but to thrive. And now I want to skip to the end of the story and tell you about the face of the sea, the 150-kilometer mass conveyor, the last ship that was brought into the ranks of the 13th Fleet. Still with me? Need a cup of tea? Thanks for listening, guys, if you are. I really enjoyed writing this narrative. Really enjoyed talking about my chapter, so I will continue to crack on. Okay, so I want you to imagine that just as on Earth today, goods are ferried around from place to place inside trucks and transport ships, super containers that cross the ocean, carrying everything you can ever hope to buy. In the 41st millennia, millions of massive transport ships cross the void. And some are big, the size of city blocks, and some are bigger. And some are the size of cities, and some are much, much bigger still. They are the lifeblood of the Imperium, carrying everything from luxury goods to food to people. Yes, people. Human trafficking is not only legal in the 41st millennium, it's positively encouraged. The average citizen will never leave the planet of their birth unless they join the Guard or the Navy. And most of them never even leave the city or the habitat in which they're born. However, if a world needs resettling after it's been decimated, or if a forge world needs a few million workers, or for any other reason you might care to imagine, then massive conveyors are loaded with human cargo and sent off into the void. And in the case of the passengers packed inside the universe mass conveyor, the face of the sea, they were sent into space to die. The face of the sea was the last great ship to join the 13th Fleet, and this only happened about 500 years from the present day. In M4149, it left Primaris World Cable Harbour with 5 million souls on board, and it was registered to carry no more than 2 million. Why was the ship overloaded? Why were people on board sent into space to die? Well, to answer that question, I need to tell you a little story. The planet, Cable Harbour, was starving. It was buckling under its own weight. It could not ferry in enough supplies to feed the populace, and recent Xenos and Chaos incursions before the coming of the Great Rift on faraway worlds had stifled food supplies. And container transports laden with food were destroyed, and agri-worlds had been invaded and turned to dust. Of course, a local fleet had been sent to liberate the local agri-worlds and keep the shipping lanes open, but this fleet had failed, and Cable Harbour had starved. For a time, his Lord Governor, Penitent Mole, did not really care. He lived high above the common folk, at the highest point of the highest hive city, and all he would see when he looked down from the window was clouds, thick, rolling clouds of smog and filth, which from 5 miles up looked rather lovely to his eyes. All those yellows and browns. Of course, he would hear stories of unrest and the like, but he'd also hear stories about faraway wars and conquests and heroes and battles, and he preferred to listen to those kind of stories. Stories about his own planet were altogether rather depressing. Then there came periods of civil unrest, which rather troubled him, and then the money started to run out. And Mole was told by his closest advisors that Cable Harbour would soon be stripped of its title and no longer considered a primary world. And this rather displeased him, so naturally he asked why. He was told that 33%, a third of the taxable revenue was gone because 33% of the people had stopped living. And that's how they put it to him. They stopped living. Not that they had died or starved to death, but a third of the planet had just stopped living as though it was something they'd chosen to do. And to his ears, it sounded like heresy, like they'd stopped working, stopped bothering. So this got Lord Governor Penitent Mole all hot and bothered, and he decided the best thing to do was to wage war against the masses, to invade his own hive cities and kill as many people as he needed to until the rest decided to keep living. But when his military advisors told him that he could only afford enough Promethean to fuel half of his tanks, that the planet was that poor, well, that's when Mole got really, really annoyed. You see, Mole, he loved his tanks. He would drive around in them for hours shooting at things. He'd set aside miles of hive city just for himself and his tanks. Anyway, this was quite possibly the worst news that Mole had ever heard. He declared to all his advisors that he wanted more money right now. Make it happen. And so his advisors told him how he could make money. A great, great deal of money. And that's when Lord Governor Penitent Mole started to sell people. He packed them into ships and sent them off in waves. The people, of course, had no idea where they were going. The starving masses were promised anything, everything, a life of farming or fishing, a life of plenty around a faraway sun. Hell, at this point, Mole could have promised them a crust of bread and they would have left the planet. Remember, a third of the entire population had died before the news of mass starvation had even reached Mole's ears. So he sold people, waves and waves of people. Each wave of pilgrims was millions strong, and he did this again and again and again. In fact, he did this hundreds of times. I think by the end, he rather liked the ceremonies. Each ship was sent off amid a great fanfare of celebration. The larger the ship, the larger the party. And the Face of the Sea was the last great ship sent off into the void. And, as everybody who spoke with the governor said, the party was the grandest of all. A week-long lavish affair with Mole at its centre. Over the course of a number of decades, the governor managed to solve a population crisis without firing a shot. And when he finally died, he was hailed as a hero. The remaining population of Cable Harbour saw him as a saviour. He'd led their parents and grandparents to promised lands in the sky. Before Penitent Mole, there'd been starvation and disease and crowded, overflowing hab blocks. And after his great pilgrimage, well, there was plenty of food and plenty of space for everyone. Within 100 years of his death, they raised statues to him on neighbouring planets. His fame spread far and wide, and 100 years after that, he was made a saint. Saint Penitent, the Void Weaver, he who guides those to distant shores. They build shrines to him, shrines, to this day. At first, Mole sold his human cargo to fabricator stations, mining complexes, forge worlds. This is a highly lucrative trade, by the way. When forced to by the Secta Imperialis, he sent out colony ships. Who knows, maybe some of these poor souls actually made it to half-decent destinations. But there wasn't very much money in colonial work, and he avoided it at all costs. Later, when he saturated the local markets with a few billion souls, he started to deal with rogue traders, and later still penal colonies and the occasional conscript regiment for the Imperial Guard. By the time of the 200th wave of mass transports, even the Guard didn't want them. But Mole liked the ceremonies, so he kept sending people until his dying day. Not one of the people on the ships were told where they were going. They were lied to. They were told anything, and they left willingly. And by the time the Face of the Sea was sent into the void, it was sent alone and without a destination. It had no escort carriers. It had no shielding and no food and no captain or crew to speak of, just mind-locked servitors hardwired into the machinery. The servitors pressed the buttons and pulled the levers and activated the warp drive, and so the Face of the Sea slipped into the warp without a navigator and without a functioning Gellerfield. The 13th Fleet found it in M4152, which is about 500 years from the present day, and at this time the Face of the Sea had been lost in space for a few hundred years. The 13th were anchored around an unremarkable star, uncharted, hiding in the dark. Ships of the line were coming and going, leading missions to distant shores, distant battlefields, and the ships of the estate were picketed close to the system core while the combat ships came and went. The defense monitors all strung out aligned them, forming almost fortress walls. Deployment was typical. Everything was safe and quiet, and while deployed, broad tether auspex scans were sent far and wide as fishermen might cast their nets out, and frigates and corvettes prowled the deep. And the auspex came back with something, a heat signature halfway to the ore cloud and about 1 month's hard burn distance. And the frigate, the last spear, was thrown out into the darkness to investigate, and a month later, the last spear found a giant, 150 kilometers long, with reactors still churning. The face of the sea filled the scanners and blotted out the stars. And a second ship was embedded in its side like a tiny blade sticking out of the belly of a bear. The last spear was crewed by humans, not Astartes. The captain, a middle-aged woman by the name of San Gabon, had 200 Navy Militarum with the 13th Regiment beneath her, and they were all very, very nervous. They had not expected to find anything out here in the deep, let alone a behemoth. They established a safe and distant geometric orbit around the conveyor and began their scans. They noted the designation of the mass conveyor. They noted its port of harbour. They noted its name and history, and they found that it was lost to the warp 233 years earlier. And they found life signs. High wavelength auspex reported no more than 1,000 souls, but none of those persons were on the bridge. The bridge was empty. No navigators or astropathic responses. All scans showed that the life signs were found close to where the second ship stuck out of the side of the face of the sea like a small steeple from a church. They scanned the second ship. Dead, inert, reactor core ejected. Designation point of harbour, name and classification unknown. Visual recordings determined it was Imperial design, but not a design that the cogitators recognised, and that was most peculiar. The 13th do not like peculiar. Peculiar can get you into all sorts of trouble. So Captain Sangabon moved the last spear to a 10-kilometre orbit, switched to amber alert, fired up the shield arrays. She contemplated warming up her macro cannons as well. If the last spear was being scanned back, then pumping reactor power into her primary guns would probably be noticed and would probably not be considered that friendly. But she fired them up anyway. And she waited 10 minutes, 10 long minutes, to see if she'd be met with any signs of aggression. When nothing happened, she launched a servitor drone for a closer visual inspection, reasoning that perhaps the cogitators could not recognize the second ship as half of it was buried in the face of the sea. The unthinking servitor drone flew right up to the surface of the ship and began scanning, pict reading, recording, and this is what they found. The second ship had not crashed into the face of the sea, but had merged with it, as though it had translated half inside of it. It was a military vessel, and it was old. All identifying features placed the date of the ship as Crusade or pre-Crusade era, and that meant the ship was over 10,000 years old, but it didn't look that old. The parts that could be seen anyway. It looked new. On the last spear, a message flashed up on the local cluster comms, and it said, "You had better come aboard." And the message had come from the face of the sea, evidently sent by a mid-range Vox unit, personal, low-tech. Sangamon stared at the message for a while and sent the reply, "Why?" She thought it was as good a response as any. The reply message flashed up, "Because he wants to see you." Who sent Sangabon? Didn't know what else to say. The message flashed back. The last Space Marine. An hour later, Captain Sangabon and 100 Navy Militarum were on board the face of the sea, an empty loading dock covered in filth, discarded machine parts, broken wall panels, broken deck panels. Only 1 in 10 lumen globes stuttered with light. Behind them, their transporters were steaming in the ripe air, and there was no one there to meet them. And for a few long minutes they stood alone, listening to the ship creak. around them. It felt like a dead thing. It smelt like a dead thing, as though they were inside the carcass of a great beast. Before leaving her ship and stepping on board the mass transporter, she had spoken to a number of people over the Vox, passengers on the face of the sea. Only they did not call themselves passengers, they called themselves survivors. She asked them where they'd been for the last 233 years and many other questions, and how they came to survive and who was the last space marine. And they answered. They said the face of the sea had passed into the warp with 5 million souls on board and no Gellerfields and no navigators, and as we all know, the warp is a hungry, thirsting realm of demons. And without the protection of the Gellerfields, it was like ringing a dinner bell or dropping a bloody juicy steak into a shark tank. The face of the sea was swarmed. Demons appeared on every deck. And first came the fast and small kind, then the bigger creatures, and then bigger still. The passengers on board the face of the sea were undefended. They were easy meat. They were picked apart. But the warp is a fickle thing, raw chaos. Time and space have no concept there, and all strange and impossible things can happen. And one of those impossible things happened. A second ship, a light cruiser, 2 kilometers in length, slammed into the side of the face of the sea while it was in the warp and fused with it. This ship did have a crew and functioning Gellerfields, and the people on board were very surprised to find themselves embedded in another ship. The second ship deactivated their warp drives, dropped back into real space, dragging the face of the sea with them and all the remaining passengers and all the demons too. Once in real space, many of the demons who had yet to find an organic host or did not have the anima to remain faded back into the warp, but that still left a whole lot of trouble behind. As well as the demon hosts, bloodborne and lesser and greater demons that had the will to remain, there was also 1 million plus humans who had been driven mad by the experience of being lost in the warp. No one could say how long the face of the sea had been in the Imperium as well, whether it had been a few short minutes or years, and no one knew how infested the ship really was. But most of the people who were left alive on board were stark, raving mad, and there were demons everywhere still. And so the slaughter began, and eventually the fight back. The stark, raving mad killer survivors, well, they killed demons, and they killed each other too. And the demons, well, they also did a pretty good job of killing each other as well, as demons do. Slaanesh killed Khorne, Nurgle killed Siege, etc., etc. But really it came down to a few groups of survivors and diehards holding out here and there and barricading themselves away down below the bilge decks and gutter runs. And it came down to the Space Marines. There were 3 of them on board the second ship, and about 500 men-at-arms and 100 combat servitors. And at first they stayed aboard the remains of their own ship, which had been impaled into the face of the sea, and they battled to make it secure. Then after a week, they took the fight to the demons and the stark raving mad on board the face of the sea. To be fair, by this time there was very little left. The 5 million had been reduced to about, 50,000, and only about 1,000 were sane. Most of the demons had blinked back into the warp, and only the strong demons remained, and the strongest of the demons who had enough anima to remain. And of the 50,000 humans, only the strongest of the stark raving mad, who had formed into slaughter packs and drank blood and collected skulls, well, only they remained. It took many months for the 3 Space Marines to clear the entire ship, and by the end of their campaign, only one was left alive, the last Space Marine. He took control. He vetted the survivors, weeding out any warp taint, purging them with fire and sending them to the arms of the Emperor. And when that was done, he put the rest of the humans to work. Due to the high numbers of casualties amongst his own crew, there was enough food on his frigate to feed the 1,000 or so who was left for many, many, many years. But they had to work to earn their food, and that way a kind of society, a kind of order, a kind of routine was established, and that way they managed to survive. And the face of the sea tumbled slowly through the void for 13 years until it was finally discovered by the last spear of the 13th Fleet. Perhaps it was provenance. Captain Saint-Gabon jumped in surprise when the doors at the end of the docking bay groaned open, revealing a single lone figure. Big. Power armor. Astartes. He came striding towards them. She tensed. Suddenly the 100 troopers she had with her didn't seem like enough. The Astartes wore an older mark of power armor, which did not bear any colours. It didn't reveal which chapter he was from. It was clean ceramite grey. A massive power sword hung from his hip, as long as she was tall, and he looked like a knight of old. He stood before her. He looked down at her. You, she swallowed. You are the one who saved this ship? He nodded. Who are you? I have learned that names have power, said the Space Marine, a calm, deep voice. I think I'll keep hold of mine. But who are you? She blurted. Your armor, it's bare plate. There are no chapter colors. What chapter are you from? Where are you from? I am not from a chapter. I came from a legion. But now I am a legion of one. I am a knight errant. I am chosen of Malcador, the Sigillite. Malcador, said Saint-Gabon. Sigillite. How? She muttered. What? How? What? The Space Marine spoke firmly, his voice like iron. I left the Sol system 5 years after the start of the Horus heresy. I was sent by my liege, Captain Garrow, to reach Macragge, to find a way through the ruin storm. I was in the warp for 20 days before my ship met the universe mass conflare. When we translated out, we were 10,000 years in the future. Macragge, muttered Saint-Gabon. Sol. Garrow. More words were spoken, more tales were told, and eventually the last Space Marine, who would later become known as Brother Captain Sol Garrow, and the 1,000 survivors from the face of the sea, along with the universe mass conveyor itself, joined the 13th Fleet. Okay, I'll bring this story time to a close now. Thank you very much for listening. I hope this answers a bunch of your questions, because now you'll know where the 13th find themselves in the new 41st millennium, and now you know how the 13th Fleet operates, how it moves around space, how big it is. Now you know how we got our first cruiser at the start of things, and now you know about the universe mass conveyor and the story behind Matthias and the story behind Sol Garrow. If you like these stories, please leave comments, feedback. I'm interested to hear it. I've got more stuff if this proves popular. Anyway, that's it. I want to go. Thank you very much for listening, and happy wargaming.